It's extremely precarious. The resignation of the government just adds another layer of complexity to what is already a very complex and difficult situation. It raises the obvious question, who's in control? And whenever there's a vacuum in authority, there will always be concerns about who it is that steps up to fill that vacuum. I think the people of Lebanon themselves will be concerned about who does step up. Is it the military? Is it one of the armed militia groups like Hezbollah? But equally, I think Lebanon's regional neighbours will be concerned, particularly Israel. They'll be concerned at anything that indicates that an Iran-aligned group like Hezbollah increases its authority or attempts to step up into that space. The role of the French president is really quite extraordinary. Almost immediately in the aftermath of the catastrophic bombing, he jumped on a plane, went to Lebanon. And some of the things he said on arrival were really significant. He said things like, France will never let Lebanon go. He said, the heart of the French people beats to the pulse of Beirut. Very personal, very emotional. Of course, France has a long history of economic and cultural ties with Lebanon, but to see a post-colonial power stepping in like that is quite unusual.
It is indeed, and I think welcomed by many Lebanese to see that leadership in the context of that vacuum that you mentioned. Let's look at the Brereton inquiry. This is the Inspector General for Defence into allegations of war crimes by our special forces. What are the likely findings in this report which the government's expecting within the next month or so?
Kieran, all indications are that a number, if not most of the allegations and claims will have been substantiated, that a number of individuals will be found to have committed war crimes or other illegal acts in Afghanistan. The inquiry is specifically into our special forces soldiers. At least that's the main focus of this inquiry. I think the findings will be both in relation to individuals, and there'll be recommendations in relation to what further action needs to be taken there. And there will also be findings in relation to systemic failures, failures of leadership. And one of the key questions for the inquiry will be how far up the leadership chain, how far up the chain of command do you go in allocating responsibility?
So in that context, where do the recommendations head in your view?
Well, as I say, if there are substantiated findings in relation to individuals, and we have to remember this is not a court of law. This is an inquiry, it's a fact-finding inquiry. It will make recommendations based on the facts, but some of the recommendations may be to take matters forward to either military tribunals, to civilian courts. The recommendations in relation to systemic failure, I have no doubt will go to the heart of culture and the special forces elements in the Australian Defence Force. We've already seen some pretty key statements from government. I note that the government recently announced that Major General Paul Kenny will be the next commander of the Special Operations Command in Australia. He will be the first non-SAS officer to run the Special Forces elements in the Army. That's significant. I note today the Chief of the Defence Force, General Campbell, announced that there will be an inquiry into the culture, what he was reported as toxic culture in the ADF. That's significant. I feel the government really is setting itself up to be able to implement some wide-ranging recommendations about changing the culture of our special forces.
The Defence Minister said it's going to, this report, make many Australians uncomfortable, dismayed. And in terms of those changes you allude to going forward, what sort of thing would you need to see? You mentioned culture. Is that the fundamental shift?
Look, I think some context here is very important, Kieran. We need to remember that these troops in the elite special forces performed an extremely difficult job, extremely well on behalf of the Australian people through the government and the Australian Defence Force. They had an incredibly high tempo of operational activity when they were in country, taking the fight to the enemy, very effective in taking out high-value targets, terrorist targets. And not only was the tempo of operations high in country, but in order to get enough people in country, the tempo of rotations was very high. So some of these soldiers would have been rotated 4, 5, 6, even 7 times in theatre. We need to bear that in mind. None of that will excuse any individual who's found to have committed a war crime, but I think it is important the Australian people keep that context, and that will be part of the findings, I have no doubt, from this recommendations from this inquiry, how the ADF better manages the people that are fighting the wars on our behalf.
And Mark Watson, finally, as we're discussing that, the Afghan government, as the US government's trying to come up with a peace deal, they're planning to release Hekmatullah, who killed 3 Australian soldiers back in 2012.
That's right, Kieran. This will be very, very distressing news for a great many Australians, in particular the troops who fought for a very long time in Afghanistan, in the fields and valleys of Afghanistan, made great sacrifices. It will also be particularly bad news for the comrades of those individual soldiers who died or were wounded. Hekmatullah was a sergeant in the Afghan Defence Forces who turned his weapon on the Australians. He then fled, and the Australian government mounted a very intense 6-month campaign to find him and return him to justice in Afghanistan. That occurred, and he was found guilty in a court in Kabul. Anything that is done now, no matter what compromise the Afghan government feels it needs to make with the Taliban to advance the peace process, any effort to release Hekmatullah at this time, I think, would be seen as a great betrayal by a lot of Australians. And given that Hekmatullah was originally sentenced to death by that court in Kabul, failure to serve out a full life term, I think, would be seen by most as a complete travesty of justice.
National Security Advisor at Bondi Partners, Mark Watson, as always, thanks.
Thanks, Kieran.